Good evening from Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us. My name is Charlie Coker, and I am the Executive Director of Asia Society Southern California. Thank you for joining us for our program this evening, Standing Against Racism in the Time of COVID, Part 2. This is a follow-on to our May 3rd event, and tonight we will be exploring the themes of collaboration and allyship and education. Before we get started with our program this evening, I'd like to introduce President of Asia Society Global, Josette Sheeran, who will have a few words for us this evening.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and good evening or good morning, wherever you're joining in the world. I know we have many countries joining us, people from throughout America and throughout the world. This is a vital time for America and the world to walk our talk in the fight for justice and dignity. With multiple crises befalling us, perhaps humanity will finally get the message we're all in this together, and that we will rise and fall together. Asia Society was founded in such a moment over 6 decades ago, in the ashes of World War II, where literally massive death and destruction followed misunderstandings and hatred in the world. And today, as much as ever, we need to join together and stand together. I want to thank Charlie Coker and Asia Society Southern California for really pioneering this series for us, this vital series, Standing Against Racism in the Time of COVID, the first program on May 3rd. I was so honored to be part of, with Lisa Ling, Van Jones, Marc Morial, who's with us again tonight, Janet Yang, so many pioneers in this area. In June, Marc also joined us at our Global Diversity Leadership Program, where we explored the issue of rising anti-Asian sentiment and how the many, many corporations and companies and leaders present, hundreds of them, and how they could help mitigate biases within and outside their own companies. We also held a pioneering dialogue in Singapore with Asian companies on discrimination against LGBTQ employees. All of this work is built on our foundation, founded in the founding vision of John D. Rockefeller III, that building bridges of understanding is the most important work, and in some ways the toughest work that we have to take on as humanity, not only to avoid war, but to build prosperity and equality and opportunity throughout humanity. The panel today includes a leader of Asia Society, Dr. Tony Jackson, who's our Global Vice President of Education. I hope he'll talk about his own pioneering work in helping high school students throughout America prepare for a globalized world and how to succeed in that. And I've seen the power of this transformational work on education equity, on students coming out of some of the toughest schools in America and schools that have failed before, but prepared to take on a world and confident that their diversity is actually the key to their strength and the key to their success. And so Tony will be with you tonight, along with many other giants. And Charlie, what a great group that we've put together. This program will focus on education and allyship and how it can help address racism at our root. Our common ground is that every human being has the right to full dignity, equality, respect. And this is not only in our interest, it's deeply at the core strength of what America has been great and what can make America stronger in the future. I loved what Van Jones said on May 3rd, Charlie, at the previous program. He said, Team America is most powerful when it embraces and is led by the diversity of humanity. And that is America's strength. And tonight I want us to remember that. Marc, you have said that good people can be part of a rotten system. And now's the time, I think, to rally the good people to really take that on and stand together. And this is the path beyond the fear that has really beset so many people at this time of COVID, beyond conflict and to greatness out of these multiple crises we face. So Charlie, thank you for pulling this group together. back to you, and I look forward to the insights.
Josette, thanks for your eloquent words. And now we'd like to welcome our partner organization on this wonderful program that we hope to have for you tonight. Marc Morial, President of the National Urban League.
Thank you very, very much. And let me thank Charlie and Josette. Let me also thank all of the members and leaders of the Asian Society for their determined outreach, for their allyship, and for their commitment to overcoming hatred and racism in America. This is a simple proposition. Hatred against Asians, hatred directed against African Americans, Jews, Muslims, Latinx, LGBT, or anyone are all fruit of the same poisonous tree. And our goal is to knock that tree down, is to tear it down and destroy its roots so that it can't reappear and it can't grow, and we can plant and build a new tree of unity, humanity, dignity, and togetherness. That's the task. In the last 100 years, Asian Americans have felt the sting of racism, notably in the treatment by our own nation through the internment camps in World War II. African Americans felt the sting of exclusion and discrimination in the 20th century through the system of de jure segregation in the South and de facto discrimination and segregation in the North. Latinx, LGBT, those of the Jewish faith can point to systemic exclusion, discrimination, and hatred directed at them. Why do we live in a nation today where in the last 4 years, hate crimes are on the rise? Will we tolerate a nation where hatred and hate speak and hateful actions become normalized, sanctioned, and applauded in the public square by elected officials, some, and politicians? Tonight, as we hear a discussion by some great people, Nikole Hannah-Jones, Frank Wu, Tony Jackson, Rev James Lawson, Stewart Kwoh, Viet Thanh Nguyen, my own friend and brother, Ambassador Michael Lawson, who leads the Los Angeles Urban League. In these times of great challenge, let us keep in mind that our words must always lead to actions. And that as we promote greater understanding, we have to be both learners and teachers. We have to be learners and teachers and spreaders of a better sense of human dignity and understanding. This time, when there's a new awareness about an old systemic issue, that being institutionalized racism, let us understand that changing institutional racism requires changing the institutions of America, private business, government, the media, higher ed, and many others. So today I'm just proud to be a part of this growing partnership between the National Urban League and the Asian Society of Southern California, which certainly is led and included by our friend and brother, Ambassador Michael Lawson, And I encourage a powerful discussion today. And thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Marc Morial, for those insightful and powerful words. Now I'd like to introduce to you the first panel for tonight's program, which will be moderated by Michael Lawson, President of the Los Angeles Urban League, our collaborative partner in this program for this evening. Michael, in addition, prior to joining the Los Angeles Urban League, was an ambassador in the Obama administration, and prior to that served for more than 31 years as a partner with Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flown. Michael will be joined by the Reverend James Lawson Jr., who is an iconic figure of the civil rights and racial justice movement. Reverend Lawson advised Martin Luther King in the 1950s and 60s on the nonviolent movement and was an instrumental figure in organizing the lunch counter sit-ins in the 1960s, the Freedom Rides, and the Meredith March in 1966. Reverend Lawson is joined by Stewart Kwoh, who is the founder of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. Stewart is a nationally recognized leader and expert in race relations and a former MacArthur Foundation fellow. Stewart will be joined by Viet Thanh Nguyen, University Professor, Harold Arnold Chair of English and Professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. Professor Nguyen's first novel, The Sympathizer, is a New York Times bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It is an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be working with these three outstanding panelists today. I think I want to start with Reverend Lawson. And by the way, we are not related, although I would be proud to be in his family tree. Reverend Lawson, what is your sense of where we are in this 21st century? We've experienced a situation where you had a rainbow coalition of people responding to and protesting the murder of George Floyd, not just in the city in which that occurred, but throughout the country and quite frankly, throughout the world. Given the arc of your experience, how would you describe the progress that has been made and the progress that is being made? You are still muted.
Well, I'm not sure how to deal with that question. We're in the 21st century with so many of these issues now because of the great movements of the 20th century. And 21st century as it is now could not be without those movements of the past. And so it has to be said that things today are not like they were in 1940, 47 when I started college, or even 80. They are almost in some instances a kind of a radical change. However, I want to say that the world as we know it today is in large measure a world that the United States of America shaped. Martin King said, the United States of America, my country, is the #1 purveyor of violence. Well, I think it has to be said that the need for the massive revolutionary change is in the United States. And the United States is still being largely influenced by the structures and the spiritual poisons of four historical forces of our history. The historical force of racism, the historical force of sexism, the historical force of violence, and the historical structure of what I call plantation capitalism. Our world economy is primarily rooted in organized plantation capitalism. So it's my thesis that whatever progress we can make has to be in the dismantling of the ideological spirits as well as the structural spirits of racism, violence, sexism, and plantation capitalism. That in the 21st century, the job of dissolving the wrong, ending the evil, spiritual and physical, is the critical task still at hand. We really do not have yet space for the diversity we need, for the access we need, for the democratic spirit that we need, in large measure because these four deeply rooted historical forces of almost 300, 400 years duration have not yet been understood or displaced. So I happen to think that this is not as much a global task as it is a task that is most urgent in my country, the United States of America.
Thank you very much for that. Just a quick follow-up. One of the things that we are seeing in this multicultural response to this is something that you have been doing for most of your career. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into, how you brought in other cultures into the fight, as it were, for equality, primarily for Black people, but not exclusively?
I'm not sure I understand the thrust of that issue, Michael Lawson.
Basically, I'm looking at your bringing the nonviolence movement into into the civil rights struggle was based on your studying of Gandhi. And
well, that certainly became a part of my thinking. But however, the first question I had to ask as a youngster was, how do I fight the racial prejudice and the racism that is meted out towards me, towards my family? How do I do this? I knew I had to resist it. And at age 4, I resisted it with my fists, with anger and fighting physically. But finally, my mother caught hold of me in an incident of my fighting over racial epithets in the 4th grade, and she confronted me with it in an experience I'll never forget. And I determined, therefore, that neither on the playing field, because I was very much a sportsman by that time, neither on the playing field or on the street would I ever again use my fists or be angry in resisting, that I would find what she called a better way. So from the 4th grade, both on the play field and sports and in other parts of my life, I sought to understand how one could apply love and compassion to overcoming the enemy and to changing the racism. So it's out of that struggle that took place in junior high and high school and college that I then began to recognize the possibilities of nonviolent struggle. And especially as experimented with and put together by Gandhi in South Africa, and then also in his homeland, India. So the nonviolent component came as I was already wrestling with how you overcome prejudice and fear, and anti-Semitism also was very strong in my thinking in high school. Now, it became clear to me that Gandhi pulling together a nonviolent history of the world, because strikes and boycotts and marches and picket lines and whatnot are very ancient tools. I don't know if Gandhi recognizes, but the first strike was in the year 1170, before the current era, by workers in Egypt, who pulled off, according to our histories, the first work stoppage over issues of the job itself. So Gandhi pulled much of that together and began to experiment with it as a way of making changes both in South Africa and India. And so he is absolutely right. Many human beings, long before the current era, practiced marches and agitation and protest and speeches and petitions and civil disobedience and a wide range of activities. And Gandhi brought these together around what he called a science of social change, calling it nonviolent satyagraha, soul force, truth force.
And you brought it to the U.S.
Yeah. So I studied that for 10 years. Between 47 and 58, I was studying and reading from Europe and Asia, from Africa, from the United States, all across the globe. In fact, I read biographies and books and historic events that used essentially nonviolent theory and practice. And therefore, I knew I was preparing myself one day for a movement in the United States.
And we are blessed by your actions.
Right, so
let me now turn to Stewart Kwoh. Stewart.
Hi, Michael.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
I'd like to ask you this question. Given the current lay of the land in terms of anti-Asian sentiment, either due to the COVID pandemic and the rhetoric that we're hearing from the administration, how has this affected the relationship between African American and Asian communities? And I ask that question of you because I know that you have spent a significant part of your career making sure that your work is not done in a monolithic framework, but reaching out and bringing people together.
Well, thank you, Michael. And again, I want to thank the Asia Society as well as the National Urban League for sponsoring the series. And it's an honor to be on this panel with you and James and Viet. There's 2 points I'd like to make in answer to that question. One is collaboration is not new. And then the second is I'll address some of the collaborations that are going on now and talk about what the state of our engagement is. But I wanted to make this point that the collaboration is not new because some people are talking like this is brand new. People of color have not come together before. Blacks and Asians have not come together before. And that's just not true. In 1869, Frederick Douglass was asked in a speech he was giving what do you think about the Chinese? Let me just quote. He says, as for the Chinese, if I would favor such immigration, I answer I would. Would you have them naturalized and have them invested with all the rights of American citizenship? I would. Would you allow them to vote? I would. I want a home here, not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but I want the Asiatics to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here, both for his sake and for ours. In the internment of Japanese Americans, a number of chapters of NAACP condemned the incarceration of Japanese Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Martin Luther King spoke eloquently about the self-determination of the Vietnamese people during the Vietnam War. In 1965, the immigration laws were changed. I contend that but for the civil rights movement, that law would not have been changed. Most Asian Americans would not be in the United States of America but for the change in that immigration law, and that change was because of the civil rights movement.
Absolutely.
So the collaboration is not new, but to your question, the disengagement is real. For the last few decades, we have not had the engagement that we need to unite and to collaborate. And I would say that the protest movements have been great. The protests have been great. My sons participate. But I would say we have to take a leap at the same time to making the policy change and the behavioral changes that will be necessary for true equality. And let me just give a few examples in Los Angeles from our experience. Number one, a lot of Asian Americans are not getting tested because they fear going out of their homes because they fear getting attacked. I think that is a room for coalition building with Blacks and Latinos who are also not getting tested and who have an extremely high rate of infection and mortality.
Mm.
Just 3 weeks ago, 12 Asian American groups came together in Los Angeles to support affirmative action, and some of them did not support affirmative action before. So this is happening on the spot as I talk. As you know, Michael, the LA Urban League is uniting with the Chinese American Citizens Alliance because they're uniting to speak to the police commission in 2 weeks together to demand an end to police brutality in Los Angeles and to have true police reform. These things are happening on the spot. The Asian Americans Advancing Justice united with 2 major Latino groups to implement the disaster relief program to provide undocumented workers with relief, which the federal government has not done, but the governor did do. And then finally, Viet was on this program, the Asian Americans that appeared on PBS May 11th and 12th, where 7 million people tuned in. And we were asked I helped to raise $2.5 million out of the $5.5 million budget. But my wife and I were asked to write a curriculum, 36 lesson plans based on the PBS documentary. And so we have finished that, and it will be on the PBS Learning website as well as the Advancing Justice website. And we hope that over 1 million students will get that. And this will be part of a movement on ethnic studies with Blacks, with Latinos, with American Indians, so that America can, long-term, can grasp the true struggles and the contributions that Blacks, Latinos, American Indians, and Asian Americans have given to America, our homeland. So let me just say, yes, we have a history of collaboration, but yes, we need to take a leap now to unite together.
Thank you, Stewart, for that eloquent history. And you're so right, so right. I want to go now to Viet Nguyen. I want to say, first of all, that I recently read your very powerful article in Time magazine about many things, including the fact that discussion of that one of the Minneapolis policemen at the scene when George Floyd was killed was Asian American, and the repercussions of that. But in your writings, I saw something that was very eloquent, and I'd love you to elaborate on it. In your writings, you talk about how traditional liberal ideas about race relations have to be challenged and discarded, and a more granular, pragmatic approach devised. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question, Michael, and it is an honor to be here with you, Stewart, Kwoh, and Reverend Lawson, and thanks for mentioning the Time article. I wrote the Time article out of a visceral response to, as many of us had, to witnessing the murder of George Floyd, and even more viscerally to seeing that there was an Asian American policeman involved. And I think my reactions were born out of the fact that two of the most important aspects of my political experience are that I am a refugee and that I am an Asian American. And these are complicated identities to have in this country. And then to respond to your question, you know, one of the things that I think about is something that I was taught by my teacher, the writer Maxine Hon Kingston, who in her book, The Woman Warrior, said that it's absolutely crucial for Asian Americans in the face of the histories of exclusion and discrimination and violence that have been directed against us to claim America, to claim this country. And I think that's a very powerful call, and it's a very liberal call that resonates with many, many people in this country. But if we were to go granular on this, I think what we have to acknowledge is that we have to claim America, all of America, not just the lofty ideals of America that make liberals feel good, that make many of us feel good, but all of America, which includes what Reverend Lawson talked about in terms of ongoing and endemic racism, sexism, violence, and what he called plantation capitalism. I'd use a slightly different set of terms, which is that these lofty liberal ideas of America that all of us, or many of us, love, happen to be built on and inextricable from the foundational sins of this country, which are that it was founded on genocide, on slavery, and on colonization, and that the legacies of these experiences are completely embedded through almost every aspect of American society today, which is why we still have an enduring problem of racist police violence against Black people and many other people as well. Now, I'm also a refugee, and what that means is that I recognize that why I am here in this country does not fit into the narrative of immigration that pleases liberals and also pleases a lot of Asian Americans. We like to say that we've come here to make this country better. But we have to recognize that we are here as immigrants coming in automatically privileged because we happen not to be Black and we happen not to be Native. But if we're refugees, many of us are here because of wars that the United States fought overseas. And to bring this up makes a lot of people, including liberals, kind of uncomfortable, because we as refugees are expected to be grateful to the United States. But as I've said many times, perhaps we wouldn't need to be grateful to the United States if the United States hadn't bombed us in the first place. This is a very complicated history. And the presence of Tu Thao, the Hmong American policeman, at the event of George Floyd's murder condenses all of this. Because Tu Thao is Asian American, but he's also Hmong. And we just need to remember that the Hmong, many of them, fought on the side of the Americans in the Vietnam War and paid a terrible price. About a quarter of the Hmong who fought with the Americans were killed during the war. And then they were brought here as a traumatized population and put into very complicated, racially and economically fraught situations that they weren't prepared for. And the long-term consequences of that are the presence of people like Tu Thao in racist incidents. And so we as Asian Americans, as Southeast Asians, as immigrants, as refugees, we have to talk about all these kinds of issues. We have to acknowledge the complexities here and the fact that Asian Americans have been victims of anti-Asian violence, but sometimes they perpetuate racism, and violence as well. That's the kind of analysis that I think we need to engage in and the kind of awareness that we need to have.
Thank you. Thank you. So how do we come together and build a coalition or several coalitions to combat the evils that the three of you have so eloquently described? As each of you has said, this is not new. We are not inventing the wheel here, but I think we are at a different inflection point. And I would ask each of you to take just a few minutes to give us your blueprint for moving forward. And Stewart, I'm going to start with you just because I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this.
Well, this is the third time I've talked to Michael today. So you know we are coalescing. What is very interesting to me, Michael, is in the last 2.5 months, I've been contacted by 4 Asian American groups who asked me, how can we connect with Black and Latino groups? We don't have an engagement. We don't have a collaborative relationship with these groups. And so I've been introducing them to groups like, as you know, the Urban League and others. But I think there's an opportunity here that we haven't had for at least a couple decades of coming together. And I think that the reality is now we are starting to come together. The question is, can we make that leap from the protest to policy change, to broad scale behavioral change? I think that's the test for all of us. So I would say, for example, the role of Asia Society with Asian American groups is you could help us match groups, get groups to come together. And then they have to figure out what do they want to focus on. So for example, as you know, the LA Urban League and the Chinese American Citizens Alliance are looking at affirmative action, police reform, anti-Asian violence, police violence against Black men in particular. So we have an agenda of action and trying to do our best to change the policies that we think are perpetuating that very unfortunate reality. And so I think this is a wonderful opportunity in a bad time where people are being killed, where people are dying because of the COVID-19. So in the midst of this crisis, we have an opportunity to come together. And I hope we don't miss the opportunity, because I think it only comes around every few decades. And we have to seize that opportunity and really work together.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I would, may I jump in here?
Please.
Because another form of work that we have to do is not necessarily directly in terms of this particular subject. So I want to talk about a work I've been doing for some 30 years in Los Angeles, in which I got my impetus in the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968. Because in Los Angeles now, a very anti-labor city, anti-union city for 100 years or so, now has 800,000 members of local unions, over 200 local unions. Those unions contain Asians of all sorts, Black people, Latina, and white. At the Martin Luther King breakfast this year, in January, we had nearly 2,000 people that represented all of these groups in the same room for the Martin Luther King breakfast day. So those unions, many of them are working on issues of social, political, economic, cultural justice. Unite 11, when you ask them these days what kind of union you are you? They say we are a justice union. All the things affecting our members and their families affect the union, and the union has to be concerned for all of those issues. This is actually a major quarrel in labor organizing across the country, but Los Angeles is leading the way. So in the practical work of how you improve the life of poor people who work every day, do not get the wages sufficient to care for themselves well, union organizing is one of the great answers. And it means that you work with all kinds of people in the Los Angeles region and in many other cities across the United States. So one collaboration is to work on the issues of economic justice, economic inequality, because that waterfront covers the fact that Asian, Indians, Latinos, and Blacks have the jobs at the bottom of the ladder economically and in terms of benefits. The inequality is more expressed in those groups than in any other groups. So one way of working for us is to work through a tangible issue that has to have economic, political, and social change. And so that's an important thing. So the Labor Federation then in California is a primary agency putting pressures on the governor and the legislature for change that affects the poor and the poor workers.
Excellent, thank you. And Viet, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Well, thank you. Well, Stewart Kwoh and the Reverend Lawson are community organizers and activists and movement people. I'm a writer, and that's both a weakness and a strength. And the strength, I think, is that my work is in stories and in narratives. And I think stories and narratives are still crucial to understanding where we are, where we should be going, and where people want us to go in ways we may not want. So, for example, Make America Great Again is a great story. I personally disagree with it very strongly, but it's obviously persuasive for a lot of people in this country. And initially, when I first heard it, I thought, the people who say this want to take us back to the 1950s. And now I think it's much more clear to me that Make America Great Again is actually about taking this country back to the 19th century. If we look at the actions directed against Asian immigration, for example, or just immigration in general, it's clearly an attempt to roll back various kinds of more progressive immigration policies to a set of policies that more express what was happening in the 19th century with Asian exclusion. And these policies are inseparable from the way by which all other peoples of color in this country would be subjugated in a 19th century kind of time. So it's important to recognize that stories play a crucial role in people's imaginations, and to counter dominant stories, we have to tell our own set of stories. Now, what would those involve? I think both Stewart Kwoh and the Reverend Lawson have clearly indicated that we draw from a tradition of storytelling about politics that gestures strongly at coalitions, solidarities, alliances, and racial and economic justice, and working against patriarchy and homophobia. All of this is very, very crucial and remains crucial. For those of us who are professional storytellers, who are writers and filmmakers and journalists and so on, we need to keep these things in mind. We have to tell stories about our own populations, our own struggles for justice, but we have to continually connect what we do and what our communities are facing to what other communities are facing as well. And then finally, I think there's an urgency here for all of us to recognize that in our own individual lives or in our own individual social circles, we encounter stories and narratives all the time. We tell stories and narratives to make sense of what's happening to us. And that is a place where each of us individually can make an intervention around the dinner table, on Facebook, on Twitter, and so on. I've seen so many struggles happening right now on social media that are very intimate of Vietnamese, Southeast Asian, and Asian Americans who say, my family is divided and torn apart by what's happening in this country, because some members of the family are leaning in one direction politically, and the other members of the family are leaning in another direction. And these are struggles over who we are as Americans, but over how we tell stories. And people every day are struggling with this and looking for help to how to confront what they see as blind racism that's endemic in a lot of Asian American communities. And so that's where I think we have to continually assert the importance of telling a different kind of story, more oriented towards coalitions, solidarities, historical awareness, and racial and economic justice.
Thank you very much. We just have a few minutes for some questions and answers that have been put into the Q&A box. One question is for Reverend Lawson. And the question is, what are your thoughts about the Black Lives Matter movement and its relationship to nonviolent theory and practice?
Black Lives Matter founders all maintain that they are rooted in nonviolent struggle. Patrice Cullors especially raises the issue how her own life is a life about how you make love the energy that transforms not only yourself, but many other people. So the struggle has been largely a nonviolent struggle. The difficulty is that the media doesn't differentiate and give us a picture of the violence. The violence comes out of USA culture because we are a culture of violence, historically and otherwise. We are a history that had 400 years of violence, whether against the Indians or the hanging of white women as witches, or the torture of Black people, the taking of the land from Mexican-speaking people, from Mexican Americans. We are a culture of violence. So in the streets, you see primarily the violence from the culture. The police represent the violence of the culture, especially in their execution of innocent people. The Antifa represents cultural violence. The anarchists represent cultural violence. The looters represent cultural violence. They do not represent Black Lives Matter. And that differentiation has to be understood and viewed in the actual scenes when we when we've seen some of the demonstrations.
Thank you very much. I believe since we started late and I do not want to hold up the rest of the program, there is more to come. I cannot thank the three of you more for the eloquence and the intelligence that you brought to this program. Thank you, each one of you, for being a part of this, and I'm looking forward to more discussions in the future. Charlie?
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to the Reverend Lawson and to Professor Nguyen and to Stewart Kwoh for this amazing panel. We hope that you will join us again at a future date to continue this conversation. And without further ado, since we did start a little late, we'd like to move on to the next panel. The next panel will be moderated by Jonathan Karp, who is my dear friend and colleague, former head of executive director of Asia Society Southern California and a former Wall Street journalist. And without anything further, I'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Charlie. And thank you to Michael for moderating that first panel and all the great speakers that were there. We also have a sterling panel now with Nikole Hannah-Jones, who is best known recently for leading the 1619 Project at the New York Times. She's a longtime award-winning investigative reporter, and she won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary this year. Frank Wu, who was recently named president of Queens College and has taught at many universities. He was chancellor at UC Hastings School of Law. He taught at Wayne State School of Law, and for 10 years, he was a law professor at Howard University, the first Asian American to teach there. And of course, Tony Jackson, who heads up Asia Society's education department and is director of Asia Society's Center for Global Education, which has, as you'll hear when he talks, developed some very innovative curricula. Now, I want to get right into it because Nikole has to leave soon. So I'm going to break with protocol. Instead of one question to everyone first, and I hope Frank and Tony, you'll allow me to ask two quick questions to Nikole to make sure we can hear from her. Nikole, thank you for participating. In the first panel, we heard about somewhat of the history of Black and Asian American allyship in the civil rights era. And you've written about how the Black struggle really has been a fight for the rights of Asian Americans and other peoples of color. But how have the Black and Asian American experiences differed? We know that they share certain things, but how have they differed? And how do those present obstacles for sort of forging and taking the kind of leap that Stewart Kwoh talked about to really address racism for the next generation?
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and happy to be here with the other panelists and to have what I think is a very important conversation. And thank you to the Asian Society for hosting this talk. I think the primary differences clearly are that Black Americans, at least 90% of Black Americans, were not voluntary immigrants to this country. And there's obviously a difference when you are choosing to relocate and immigrate to a new country, trying to expand your opportunity, and when, excuse me, you were forced to come to this country against your will, excuse me, and had an entire racial caste system built upon you. So every other racial group that is choosing to come to the United States is entering into an existing hierarchy. And that hierarchy is going to typically put them somewhere between Black people on the bottom and white people on the top. That's just a different experience. The other primary difference, I think, is we know that most Asian Americans who live in the United States today arrived in the United States after 1965. We had a racist immigration quota system in this country, as well as the Chinese Exclusion Act, that really prohibited most Black and brown and Asian immigrants from coming into the country in large numbers until 1965. And then you saw a huge number of Asian Americans, of Latin Americans, and of Africans, or not Asian Americans, but Asians immigrating to America. But what also is happening in 1965, by 1965, that means we have also ended legal discrimination. So you have a population that is entering the United States and not having to undergo the racial discrimination by law that Black Americans have experienced for generations. That is going to give you a completely different experience and outlook on the country that you've chosen to come to. And I think the last thing that is important is when you are an immigrant, that is a self-selecting group. And we know in this country, particularly when it comes to non-white immigrants, we over-index for people in certain professions, and we over-index for education. That group is then being compared to 40 million Black Americans, when the more adequate comparison would be you would have to compare Asian immigrants to the United States to Black immigrants who leave America and go elsewhere. It's kind of unfair to make comparisons between an immigrant group and a native-born population and then say, well, look how much better this outside group performs than the native group. So those are kind of the three, I think, key differences.
And in terms of then building a bond, right? I mean, you talked about how Asian Americans would come in between the whites and the Blacks and typically, as you've said before, not want to align down, they'd want to align up. But now it's sort of an issue of a different alignment. And how are mindsets changing because of COVID, because of the resurgence of anti-Black police violence?
Yeah, so of course, when any person immigrates to a new country, you want to align yourself with success. You are not going to come to a new country and align yourself with the people who are most marginalized and treated as the bottom. I mean, that's just common sense. And that's what most immigrant groups do when they come to any society. The parallels, however, between the Black and the Asian experience is Black and Asian people were the two groups that white Americans actually believed, because of our physical features, could not be assimilated. And so prior to 1965, you often can see laws in places like California, certain places in the Midwest, in the South, even on the East Coast, where there was a significant amount of Asian immigration, the laws were actually against Asian and Black Americans. So I was looking at restrictive covenants in housing when I was in Detroit and when I was in parts of Long Island. And you see that they are actually restricting homes from being sold to Negroes and Mongoloids. So because of the way that we look, we have been historically treated as not being able to be assimilated. But the way that white Americans resolved that with Asian Americans was they just pretty much stopped Asian Americans from immigrating to the United States, whereas we were already here. So what we're seeing, I think, is most Asian Americans seem to reject that kind of false boundary. We see a lot of press around the cases like against the Harvard case, the affirmative action case, and the Yale case. But when you look at polling, actually most Asian Americans in polling show that they support affirmative action. And I think we have to be so careful of the way that we allow Asian Americans to be used as a wedge. Of course, this idea of model minority and trying to send this message that Asian Americans can be used as a wedge and a justification for Black disparity. And I think we're seeing a rejection of that, and we're seeing an increasing rejection of that as Asian Americans are once again reminded in COVID that they are not considered to be fully American either, and that as much as white Americans like to hold Asian Americans out as a model, it's for their own convenience. And as soon as it is no longer convenience, then they're very quick to other Asian Americans as well.
Right. And I promise to get back to you before you have to leave.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Frank, so yes, so segueing from the model minority stereotype to another term that applies to you and is in your bio, but I'd like you to talk about it. You are an Asian American, and you've been a pioneer in crossing all kinds of racial barriers as an educator. But of course, Asian American is a misnomer. It kind of captures all Asians and in reality, none. So how does this misperception sort of impact the intra-ethnic and the interracial efforts to build this solidarity toward teaching about racism better? And obviously you've been in many classroom and educational environments with all of these communities.
Sure. Asian American is a concept born of the Civil Rights Movement. That term didn't exist until 1968. But Asian American activists, this seems quaint now, there's actually a yellow power movement in California modeled on the Black Power movement. And in 1968, activists came up with this term. Well, let's take each piece of it. I often say there are no Asians in Asia. When I say that, people seem very puzzled. They say, wait, that's absurd. But it's true. If you walk down the streets of Shanghai or Seoul or Saigon, you ask the average man or woman, what are you, who are you, how do you identify? Very few say Asian, just as there aren't that many Europeans in Europe or Africans in Africa. What I mean is they identify by nationality, caste, faith, language, dialect, province. They identify by village, by clan, but not with a pan-Asian identity. 2 or 3 generations ago, Asians were fighting total wars against each other, right? Japan had the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. That was a euphemism for imperialism. So there isn't enthusiasm for pan-Asian identity. But here, when I was a kid, I was told you all look alike, right? People called me Jap, just as they called me Chink. They called me Gook. And if someone said, hey, you Jap, and I said, pardon me, I'm a Chink, that's not really going to do me or anyone else very much good, right? So you realize there's a need for mutual defense. Even if your ancestors fought someone else's ancestors, here, you're all just grouped together. Asian Americans, though, are ambiguous and ambivalent, right? We're neither black nor white, and so we were initially excluded and then sort of extruded as perpetual foreigners. And now with the rise of Asia, there's a transnational diaspora class. So I'm also very sensitive that there are some Asians in America who don't want to be Americans, right? Look, I'm a native-born U.S. citizen. I'm a kid from Detroit. I am very much American. I'm not going back anywhere other than the Motor City. But there are Asians who are visitors, they're tourists, they're exchange students, and they don't want to assimilate. So not only do they not want to be Asian, they don't want to be American either. Last thought, there have always been Afro-Asians too, and coalitions that have just been written out of the histories. Grace Lee Boggs, a radical labor activist with her husband, James Boggs, an African-American son of sharecroppers. Yuri Kochiyama, she's this famous figure. If you look at the photos of Malcolm X when he was assassinated, you might say, who's that Asian lady holding his head, right, as he's dying? That's Yuri Kochiyama, Japanese-American homemaker, who was so impressed by Malcolm X that she became one of his closest confidants and colleagues. So there's this whole ambiguity. Last example. In 1989, in Spike Lee's prescient movie, Do the Right Thing, there's an Asian immigrant shopkeeper, right? And at the end, in the climax, all right, he's defending his store, and he says, I black, like you, I black, right? And I wonder, both then and now, how that scene would play out. You know, would Asian immigrants claim that identity? Would they want to be people of color, and would they be accepted? It's an open question. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that it's a profound question to ask.
Thank you. And several elements there I'd like to come back to in due course. Let me switch to Tony. As I mentioned, Tony, your career has been about developing new ways to teach middle school students, high school students for a changing world. And during that time, I imagine that part of that is expanding curiosity and the ability to empathize. But what have you also seen about how mainstream education has sort of perpetuated racist narratives?
Sure, thanks, Jonathan. And I also want to mention how honored I am to be on this panel, and so much I've learned already. So it's a terrific experience. I mean, I think we need to acknowledge, first of all, that education really has been an enormous force in actually eradicating racism. There is a lot that has been done to help people understand the evil of racism through education, and that's a very good thing. But it is also the case, as you said, that one of the prime mechanisms for actually perpetuating racism in this country has been education, and it happens in countless ways. But I think one of the really big ways is in offering, or at least not questioning, justification for racist behaviors, particularly in service of the acquisition of money and power, or as Reverend Lawson said, in support of racism, sexism, violence, and plantation capitalism. So we have, concepts like manifest destiny, which was used to justify the genocide of millions of Native Americans, or we have the perpetual notion that's floated in this country of the mental inferiority of Black people that was a justification for slavery. It was a justification for, undermining Reconstruction and justifying Jim Crow, and it still is used today. Or we have, as was mentioned earlier, the sort of, the fact that Japanese people were rounded up to essentially concentration camps during World War II. And it was said, well, it's not about racism, it's about, trying to make sure that they were not spying for the enemy. Well, that didn't happen to German American people. And so you have to question kind of how not questioning that assumption is perpetuating these things. So there's a lot of ways that occurs. I think another important factor is just sort of thinking about kind of the nature of education and what it does and what it doesn't do. I mean, what education in its kind of essence needs to do for everybody is to provide them with the ability to think, the ability to reason critically. And I think that there's a real, well, in my view, there's a sense, and I believe it's true, that education really hasn't, for a large number of people, kind of sufficiently developed their ability to just make logical inferences and draw reasonable conclusions from the evidence that's put before them. And so essentially it hasn't armed them, it hasn't equipped them to be able to know when they're being lied to, and to be able to discern the truth from the evidence and and to make, kind of reasonable conclusions from what's put before them. So I think you have, I mean, in this world we live in today, we're kind of constantly bombarded by information, and it is the case that all of us have to do the mental work of making meaning from that information. And there just seem to be a lot of people who don't really have the capacity to do that mental work. And I don't mean to sound elitist. I'm just trying to make observation about what, why there is this call for 21st century education that focuses on critical reasoning. It's because it's absent in so many places and within so many populations. And so in the absence, people are susceptible for kind of the persuasion of somebody else doing that mental work of making meaning for you and for coming up with simple answers to very complex questions. So you have the phenomenon, for example, that there is the fact that people kind of glom onto of the conditions of some Black communities as being underdeveloped, as being reflection of the inferiority of Black people. Well, that's a simple, albeit wrong, conclusion, but it does fit the need for a simple answer to a complex question if you can't work out a complex question on your own. And so I think that's one of the other ways that education has kind of fallen short. It's really not providing the capacity to really discern the truth from all the information that's everywhere in our world today.
Thank you. And
Could I interject into that just quickly? Because I do think this is where the way that we are taught American history fails us when we're trying to create these cross-racial and cross-ethnic coalitions, because we are taught almost nothing about slavery except to talk about the Civil War, and we flatten slavery to just being, a system of discrimination and not the brutal and barbaric human rights violation and atrocity that it was. And then we'll say something like, and Chinese people suffered too when they came here and had to work on the railroad. Yes, Chinese people were deeply discriminated against, but that is not 250 years of chattel slavery. That is not an entire racial hierarchy and 100 years of racial apartheid that follows. And also, in my essay, I go very quickly over covers 400 years of history, so there's only so much detail you can put in there. But I talk about birthright citizenship, and that every Asian American, European American, Latin American, African American who comes here and has a child, your child is automatic citizenship because of the fight of formerly enslaved people. That we are one of the only countries in the world that grants birthright citizenship. The universal right to vote, the fact that you can't be discriminated against in public accommodations, these all come out of the Black resistance struggle. And immigrants are not taught that when they come to this country. Instead, they are taught that Black people are problematic, that Black people have all of these freedoms that aren't doing anything with them. And when people have read, I've heard, I can't tell you, from so many Asian immigrants who have written me or come up to me after talks and said, when they read that essay, they just had no idea the role that Black Americans have played in expanding rights for all groups who are not white in this country. And having that kind of basis of knowledge opens the door then to understand why we might need affirmative action, to understand why Black communities seem to struggle like they do, but we don't get that. And that makes it very hard then to build those coalitions sometimes.
And at the same time, as Tony was talking about, in terms of building critical reasoning, it's frustrating as a lifelong journalist to see such great work by you and your team, by the New York Times, investigative work, but that doesn't have as much mass impact because of the fractured media landscape and social media, which obviously people will want to believe. How do you break that? What's the solution there to, at least at some age level that you can create new habits and new skills?
Well, one thing is you do a very evocative project that pisses a lot of people off, because we're getting a lot of play in right-wing media. We've certainly crossed boundaries, though not in the way that I would have hoped. I think we're all struggling with how do we get, I don't believe in this idea of the bubble, particularly a liberal bubble, because people I know who are liberal tend to be very white red, and a place like New York City, most of us didn't come from there. I'm from Iowa, and it's not a bubble to live in a diverse metropolitan area. But I do think that it can be hard to figure out how do you educate people, or just inform or offer a different point of view to people who already think they know or aren't self-selecting. I tend to feel like I preach to the choir, but in a subversive way. So people who come to my work actually think that I'm writing about someone else and then end up finding out that I'm actually writing about them. So I think what you have to do is, as journalists, as anyone, is tell a story that people don't know, that they think they know. It has to be provocative. It has to be surprising. The 1619 Project it's not a history. It's actually about today. And we trace history back, and people were making all of these connections that they didn't have before. But we all struggle with how to actually get people to come to the work and come to the table. I mean, I really appreciated your comments, Frank, because while I'm talking about a lot of misunderstandings amongst Asian Americans, Black Americans, of course, that is also a reciprocal relationship. And what would it mean if we were learning about these cross-racial struggles and all of the times when Asian Americans did stand with Black Americans in fighting for civil rights, but we don't get that history either.
Right. And we don't get our own histories. We don't know about what came before. So birthright is a great example. So it's out of the 14th Amendment, which was passed to end slavery. So there's just no doubt that the primary purpose of that constitutional change was to promote Black equality. And then in 1898, someone of Chinese descent, born in San Francisco, was trying to get it and was told, you can't come in. We can exclude you and your parents and all your kids. Now, when it's challenged, it's mainly about all these different communities of color in a way that no one has ever taught any of this, and they don't know about, for example, Jamaican Chinese. Charles Mingus, my favorite jazz great, was Afro-Asian. And there's this whole history that's just been glossed over, and it's not actually the margins. It's how the margins create what people see as the mainstream, right? They're the boundaries that create and define what people accept as normal.
Oh, I like how you put that.
And to that point, Kamala Harris, Naomi Osaka, Tiger Woods, is there enough critical mass in that community that can be a bridge? In the Afro-Asian community, for instance.
It also reveals hierarchy. You know, the thing is, if you can pass, and passing is a very clear definition, right? Passing means to pass as white. It doesn't mean to pass as something else. It means to sort of move up in this hierarchy. Then unless you deliberately out yourself, people just assume you're white. So people who are half white, half Asian, depending on how exactly they look, sometimes just move through the world as if they're white. But people who are Afro-Asian typically and often speak very movingly about how they were rejected by Asian grandparents and how they identified as Black because of the one drop rule, which there's just no question. The one drop rule is bigoted. It's racist. It's the idea that the purity of white blood, or in this instance, Asian blood, by any Black ancestry. So it's not symmetrical is the point. There are material differences that people have, exactly where they're from, what their family was like, and all of these other factors.
Right.
And I also just think in general, being mixed race is not going to save our country. Black people have been mixed race since we landed here, shortly after arriving in 1619. And that's how you get the one drop rule. That's how you get a system that passes lineage through the mother and not the father. So I think we do have to do away with the false notion that somehow, two people falling in love and procreating together can solve inequality, because these systems and structures are much larger than that.
No, and to that point on symmetry, and in your last 4 minutes here, Nikole, here's an opportunity to also tell people something they didn't know. At least I didn't know this. I thought you made a great point recently when you talked about how to really look at the demographics of Asian Americans vis-a-vis the demographics of Black, and where there might actually be more of a sort of a natural kinship. If you a lot of people focus on Chinese Americans, for instance, and in many cases, they are economically, more successful. And what have you seen, though, about the demographics if you just look at the other immigrants of Southeast Asian immigrant populations?
I mean, what we know, Frank talked about this, Asian is a construct, right? Just like Blackness is a construct, just like Latino is a construct. You take all of these disparate groups and you come to America, and America needs to categorize you as some other, and they create a new category. So you can look, when we were talking, before this event, John, I was talking about the arguments about the specialized high schools in New York. For people who are not in New York, these are public high schools that screen using a single test, and the schools are almost entirely Asian and white. But what they really are is Chinese American and white. And almost every other Asian group also cannot get into these high schools. But we aren't able to have kind of that nuanced conversation that in New York and in a lot of places, when you actually disaggregate that massive category of Asian Americans, you see that depending on how the immigrants arrived here, their circumstances actually very closely mirror that of Black Americans and Latinos. So when you look at Asian Americans who come as refugees, their poverty rates, their lack of getting high school, their educational rates, all of those are actually quite similar to Black Americans, but we're not able to have that more nuanced conversation. And so Asian American is being used, for instance, in New York, in the argument about the specialized high school, to say, well, this can't be racist because look at all of these Asians who are in there. But it's really that Chinese Americans specifically have focused on testing, and they're getting in, but you're not seeing large numbers of Indian Americans, you're not seeing Filipinos, you're not seeing any other group. And I wish we could have more of that nuanced conversation. Unfortunately, sometimes I try to have it on Twitter, and it's actually impossible to have a nuanced and complex conversation on Twitter.
Well, the educators who are going to take that conversation here. And I want to thank you. I know if you have to drop off, but I also don't want to give short shrift to any of our speakers. I gave very quick intros, but their full bios are on our site, and I urge you to read them and to read the links on there. So on that point, Tony, I'm going to go back to you. Thank you, Nikole. How nuanced can education of middle schoolers and underprivileged high schoolers be?
Well, I think it can be, I don't know if it's a matter of nuance, it's a matter of sort of redirecting the purpose of education. I think to a large extent what I was trying to say before is that consciously or unconsciously, education has essentially tried to be a force to reinforce the dominance of one group over another. And it's sort of in service of the whole notion of a dominant group, that it's right and okay for one group to have hegemony over another. And I think you need an education that doesn't support that kind of dominance paradigm, but rather one that supports a more egalitarian paradigm. And that's essentially what we've been trying to do for the last 20 years in Asian society. We've advanced this idea of education for global competence. And what we mean by that is an education that really kind of starts with the idea that you need to require learning that develops the capacity, as I was talking about before, for critical reasoning, for being able to use your problem solving capacities and to really understand the world in its full complexity. But it's also an education that sort of draws on the social emotional development of youth and engages them in the development of empathy and be able to look at people look at the world and from other people's perspectives, and to begin to inculcate that perspective in their own worldview. It also is about kind of recognizing that, you need to recognize and address cultural norms, and that people need to understand and have the capacity to shift their narrative and to be able to appreciate the cultural context within which they're speaking, what they're learning, and to be able to collaborate with people across different cultural boundaries. And we think also a key part of this as well is to be able to sort of put all those intellectual and social emotional skills together and develop a disposition to take action, to actually be, an actor, not a bystander, and try to make things better in the world. So that kind of education we've been developing in schools for the last 20 years across the country. So just to say that there's a practical approach to this kind of different way of educating youth towards this more egalitarian view and this anti-racist view that's in schools right now in the United States. And what we hope at some point is that it goes to a much greater scale, because it's it's not practical. It is practical, but it just has to be instantiated in places across the country and hopefully across the world if we're actually going to have a shift in what Reverend Lawson called the ideological spirit of racism.
Right. Have you found that getting buy-in from teachers or administrators has differed, whether they were Latino, Asian, white, African American?
No pattern really, because I mean, I think teachers particularly understand and relate to the idea that it isn't just about educating kind of kids for jobs. It's about educating them for citizenship and for being a fully developed person. I mean, that's what teachers really go into the profession to do. And so they understand that in this world that is so globally connected, you have to have young people, and particularly people who are coming from marginalized communities. They have to have both the academic prowess, but also the sort of capital to be able to operate within global environments, be they the kind of diversity within their own community or the world at large. And so we haven't found there being kind of resistance from this idea from the profession. Sometimes the outside communities, are a little bit skeptical, but really the profession embraces this notion that it's the full personhood of people that you're trying to develop in young people, and particularly to help them develop a deep sense of their own identity, their racial identity, their ethnic identity. That's part of what education needs to be about. And so I think that gives me great hope that there's a ground level understanding and a desire for this kind of education coming certainly from the profession, and I would say from a lot of parents as well. People understand this is a different world. We need a different education for this very different world.
Frank, in addition to your academic roles, you were the head of the Committee of 100. And because of the rising prominence of Chinese Americans, how did you see the internal debate change as social issues around discrimination and racism evolved in the US?
Sure. We're living through a moment that's unprecedented in so many ways, not just the pandemic, not just the Black Lives Matter movement becoming mainstream. We also have the rise of Asia, specifically China. And for many people, that's alarming, right? China is now poised to become the largest economy measured by various means and a rival to the United States in so many ways. So everyone's being forced to choose between Chinese cell phones and the Chinese internet on the one hand, and American cell phones, the American internet. And the world is being divided at an accelerating pace. So this means that we're now seeing cleavages even within a family, because alongside this, we have now, not just for people who are wealthy, but for ordinary middle-class folks, inability to be transnational. What I mean by that is, when my parents crossed the Pacific, they thought they might never see their parents again. When I was a kid, my mother wrote letters every day and sent by airmail, where you would fold it up and the envelope was the letter itself. And they never made long distance calls because that was prohibitively expensive. Today, on your smartphone, you can have a relationship with your boyfriend or girlfriend back home. You can share viral cat videos, right? And so we're seeing the development of this pan-Asian, trans-Pacific culture where everyone loves K-pop, for example, right? Who would have predicted that Korean boy bands would be loved by middle-aged white American women, right? Or whoever else is cheering for them as they get millions of people watching their music videos. So we're seeing all these changes, and every time we see a change like this, we have a choice. We can embrace it or find it threatening. We can build bridges or we can burn them, right? We always have an opportunity, not just leaders, but each of us individually, to ratchet tension up or down every time we face a choice like this, to regard it as confrontational and divisive, or as an opportunity for enrichment. Asia society stands for the idea of bridge building, right? And many of us individually have made our lives trying to do that. And it's just become increasingly difficult because there are demagogues trying to tear it all apart around us.
Right. No, thank you. And unfortunately, I have to wrap up now. We could go on. But I just want to leave with this thought, because all three of our speakers on this panel are involved in spreading the word and spreading the gospel to a certain extent, as Marc Morial said in his comments, that, that we have to be spreaders. And I would say, and I mean this in the best possible sense of the term, on this issue, everyone needs to be a super spreader. And anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it back to Charlie, and thank you, Frank and Tony and Nikole, who's already had to leave.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to the amazing panel. Thanks to Nikole and to Frank and to Tony for making this an amazing discussion. We would like to move on to our final panel of the evening. I'd like to introduce Jay Tucker, who's Executive Director of the Center for Management of Enterprises in Media, Entertainment, and Sports at the UCLA Anderson School of Business at UCLA. And he will introduce his panelists, and we'll go from there. Thank you. Thanks, Jay.
No, thank you, Charlie. This has been an amazing experience. Thanks to all the presenters who've come before us. I think they've set the table. And I mean, we've really talked a little bit about kind of what education would do to change our perspectives here, and how individuals can rethink the environment we're in and the relationships that we can have across communities and cultures. What I wanted to do to help kind of close the show was to have a conversation more for, folks working, folks in business. What do we do? And what can be done in organizations, not necessarily just in big Fortune 500 corporations, but also, entertainment studios, nonprofits, et cetera. But to talk about how organizations can take this kind of perspective and actually move towards action that makes an impact and that can be sustainable within your organization. So I'm really excited because I've got with me Angeline Buenaventura, who works in the mayor's office, Matt Horton, who works over at the Milken Institute. Two folks who, like me, listen a lot. We're very privileged in the sense that we get to hear from people working in the business community, in the public sector, about what's going on, in our communities and so on. And hopefully we can have a conversation where we talk a little bit more about what you can do, what organizations are already doing, and how we can tackle some of these sticky problems going forward. So what I'll do, instead of kind of reading off my presenters' bios, my guest bios, is we're just going to jump right into the conversation. I'm going to start with Angie. Can you just talk a little bit about what the mayor's office does in the entertainment space?
Sure. And well, first off, I just want to say thank you to the Asia Society of Southern California. And thank you, Jay. It's such an honor, obviously, to be on this panel, and hope that I can shed some light in terms of some of the work that we're doing here in the city. So as far as some of the work that we have been doing, what I wanted to share before I kind of dive into the details is that diversity and inclusion, as well as racial equity, it's always been clearly a priority for the mayor and the city. I mean, we have such a diverse city, so for us not to recognize the importance around, obviously, this topic would be remiss. It's an area that was a focus pre-COVID, and definitely a much more important area to continue working on, during COVID. We also recognize that the pandemic has absolutely exposed the inequities in our system, as we see it through our educational system. We see it, in various sectors. But the three things that currently the mayor is focused on, he signed an executive directive back in July. Not sure if everybody's aware, but that executive directive was ED 27, and that was focused on studying and promoting racial equity across our city departments. He also named the LA's first ever chief equity officer, Brenda Shockley, and he's also instructed each city department to appoint a racial equity officer, develop a racial equity plan, and identify strategies to promote racial equity in every aspect of our local government. As an extension of that, we also have the private task force. So recently, the mayor created a task force of leaders across each sector to develop protocols and policies to address racial equity in the private sector. And the goal with that is to share best practices and strategies, and ultimately develop a playbook for businesses to adopt the principles and implement within each of these sectors. And one of the things I do want to share is an existing program, which is a workforce development program that the mayor launched back in 2018. It's to build career pathways into entertainment for underrepresented Angelenos between 18 to 27. We have partnered with over 100 entertainment companies. We've secured 425 paid internships, which has converted into 51 full-time roles, and we've hosted 21 educational experiences. So those are the three things that currently, the mayor and our team has really been focused on as it relates to diversity and inclusion, specifically in the entertainment space.
I'm amazed by how much gets done, and I'm amazed at the focus, the level of focus on this issue that we had even before the current protests. One of the things that I see as a native New Yorker who moved to Los Angeles about 15 years ago is that LA, when we talk about diversity, means a lot more than kind of this black-white dynamic. And you can see that in the program we've had up until this point. Obviously we have a strong Latino population, an amazing Asian population. We have folks coming from all over the planet who have lived here and created their own communities in Los Angeles, across the city. I wonder if that makes it easier or more challenging to roll out programs like this.
Well, there actually are existing programs that, there are numerous programs obviously throughout the city that already exist. And I think that organization should absolutely tap into them. If we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we have partnered with numerous organizations as well. One is the Ghetto Film School. There's also the California State University, Cal State University Entertainment Alliance, which I just recently met with them yesterday, did not know that they existed. And their focus is really preparing an inclusive and diverse workforce and getting these students prepared for jobs within each of these sectors. And it really is just identifying and doing the outreach. But we have a whole list of organizations that we know already exist that I think, the private sector should absolutely tap into if they're really committed to wanting to diversify their workforce.
I love it. Matt, I want to ask you a similar question. Could you talk a little bit about some of the things that Milken has done to address diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, Jay, thanks for bringing me into this, and thanks for the Asia Society and putting it on. The Institute, for those that aren't familiar, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit economic policy think tank, and we focus on a lot of different issues related to health and where I work in regional economies, and especially in California, and looking at that regional approach, before COVID-19 really decimated local state budgets, the recovery from the last recession was hardly equitable or hardly inclusive. So this narrative around inclusion and economic development and needing a more dedicated or proactive approach has been churning for a while. So this idea about or this notion about equity and inclusion in terms of the built environment or workforce development, or how do we reform or recalibrate economic development from the ground up, is something that we've been taking a look at a lot, especially in California. So as Angela said, this idea around workforce and talent pipelines, these are the types of efforts that need more support in terms of the public-private partnerships, in terms of public policy, in terms of investments that are dedicated to filling in some of those gaps. We talk a lot about the skills gap in a number of different areas, and that may be so on some level, but it's really more about access and enhancing access to education, to mobility, to housing. Is really what we need to address in the underlying fabric of the way that we talk about or do economic development. And those are some of the principles that we're taking a look at from how those conversations occur at state and regional and local levels, and making sure that there's a focus on people, on investments that that solve for some of those deficiencies, but our work is really revolving around some of those core issues as well.
So, and I should probably note that the Center for Memes at UCLA Anderson does something similar in the sense that we're also trying to make business leaders smarter about how to harness innovation across the entertainment industry, how to leverage technology, how to leverage people, how do we, move towards success. And so one of the things that I think you'll hear from all three of us is this idea that there are these kind of big sticky problems that don't simply impact an individual or an individual company, but instead, kind of permeate the industry or the community, the city, the state, because they're problems that can't really be solved by fiat, and they're problems that can't necessarily be solved by simply adding resources. In some cases, we have to really help people reframe the way they think about certain processes. We have to provide for ourselves. We have to act as conduits to provide access to industry leaders, to talent or to ideas. And so part of what we're talking about today is applying those same principles to address this issue of diversity and inclusion.
That's a good point, Jay. And you look more specifically at some of those underlying structures. It came up a lot in the last panel when it was mentioned in name about redlining. And so how much of our current systems have embraced these legacies of redlining, whether it be in terms of capital access for minority small business owners, or whether it be in terms of housing. How have we embraced these types of principles, and how do we come up with a really more equitable or anti-racist really approach that mitigates these historic legacies that continue to really inhibit economic mobility and larger economic growth for the state, for the city, and for the country?
That's one of those things. Go ahead, Angie.
And Jay, I wanted to add, and you had noted access, and I think access here is the key thing. And some of the work that I've done in South LA when I was driving the marketing and the branding for Baldwin Hills Crenshaw, what we noticed was we were really focused on creating an inclusive place. Although it was predominantly an African American and Latino neighborhood, what we knew is that we were creating quality program, and we wanted to create a place of inclusion. So we created programming across the board, whether it be for educational programming, whether it be entertainment programming. It was really focused on inclusion as opposed to just diversity, because we wanted to draw from all parts of the city. So I think access here is critical, and I think if you provide the quality programming, I think that's where you start to build a place of inclusion. So going back to the whole systemic piece, I think it is addressing the underlying issues within these organizations, but getting folks to really understand the importance, because as we very well know, our society is significantly changing, and having to really address the fact that success for any organization should be reflective of the society that we live in. And I don't think that is something that people, well, I don't want to say that, but I don't think that's something that we are absolutely recognizing and embracing, which is why we continue to be in these situations.
So I want you to stay on that though. So you talked about some of these programs that you were running. I'd love to use one of them as a case study. Can you talk about some of the programming you did and who benefited? What did you do, right? How did you make it happen?
It was through public-private partnership. It was really through partnerships. So I'm really big on and advocating for strategic partnerships. And, we didn't necessarily have a budget that of Westfield or that of Simon, but what we did was we collaborated with organizations such as the Grammys. We collaborated with organizations such as Disney, who really wanted to kind of tap into and provide quality community programming. And through that, we were able to draw numbers. So the property itself obviously was struggling. And for those that don't know, Baldwin Hills Crenshaw is one of the oldest regional shopping centers, in the country. It's on the corner of Martin Luther King and Crenshaw. And in terms of retail offerings, we lacked in retail offerings. But what we did do to really draw the community in was provide a sense of programming that spoke to different audiences. So through our partnerships, we were able to draw folks into the center. And it wasn't, people didn't come to shop, but what we did know were people were coming to attend the programming that we did have. And we would draw anywhere from 300 to 5,000 people. So again, this really comes down to really knowing, for me, it's just, it's if you build it, they will come. And I think if you build quality programming, individuals will come.
So I want to stay on this and bring Matt into the conversation also, because one of the things that you had at that time was your expertise about the industry itself, about entertainment, about music specifically, but also some knowledge about what was going on in the community and at that shopping center, which was actually the place where I used to get my haircut. As you can see, I haven't had one of those in a while. But that was one of the first shopping centers I used to go to. And absolutely recognizing that it was an anchor point in the community that was really being underserved. And you had the ability to kind of figure out very quickly how you could navigate that space and create an opportunity. One of the things that I recommend very often is this idea that sometimes we have to seek expertise that's outside of the organization. And your point earlier about partnerships, speaks to that, that sometimes, we want to solve a problem, and there are people on the ground with the knowledge of how to do it, but they lack the resources, or vice versa. And finding partners that can help you really move the needle is super important, whether we're talking about diversity and inclusion or other issues. And I know Matt in his role has had, experience with tons of partnerships as well. Matt, I would love if you could just talk about one or about your perspective on using partnerships.
Well, the partnerships, I think, are key, and we always use this term, and I think we overuse the term of public-private partnerships and collaboration, but it's really vital because of the real lack of capacity, I would say, and Angeline can correct me from a city standpoint, but a lack of capacity in terms of staff and resources at a city or local public sector role really limits their ability to talk about an investment prospectus, or to engage with or engage in some of these conversations, because they're busy keeping the lights on. So how do we form an incentive-based model that is collaborative and cooperative in terms of demographics and age groups and sectors that are really intent on making sure that regions in and around the state and around the country have a more resilient model, or built around a more resilient model, and not just in terms of climate, but economically as well. So good jobs, quality infrastructure, low pollution. These are all things that certain communities take for granted, but those social determinants of health that Raj Chetty talks a lot about in his work at the Opportunity Center there, the offshoot from Harvard. Those social determinants of health largely fall on communities of color. They affect their life and economic mobility in ways that other zip codes, other wider zip codes don't affect. I mean, these things might not be intentional, but they aren't accidents. And so how we can start to think about the ways that we're directing investments in place, making sure that we're making it easier for businesses to form. California, for example, in LA is the epicenter of small businesses in the country. These businesses are vital epicenters of employment and economic growth and mobility. So we need to make it easier for businesses to form and operate and to employ. We need to make sure that we're forming quality regions that support good jobs. I don't think, nothing against minimum wage work, but I don't know anybody on this call that would want their kids or their family to be dependent on minimum wage labor for the rest of their lives. This is a racial equity issue. This is a quality of life issue that we need to take more seriously in building more resilient economies.
So I want to take that last point and expand. You teased before, you're talking about the talent pipeline, and you heard Angeline earlier talk about one of the programs that the city launched and the successes that it's had. My working theory is that there's not a talent pipeline problem, right? When we talk about tech or entertainment, we often hear that we don't have as much diversity and inclusion as one would desire because the talent just isn't there to be found. I don't know that that's really the problem, right? So I suspect that there are other challenges, like how do you identify that talent, especially if your intake system is designed to go to 2 or 3 sources that traditionally exclude certain people, or how do I help retain talent when I found it? You know, those are other kinds of issues, but I don't know that the issue here is the talent pipeline and whether or not we have enough humans in that pipeline exclusively. I suspect that there are other issues like access. We've talked about that a little bit before. And I certainly don't believe that our talent pipeline problem has to do with potential, right? I don't think we took a look at young people across Los Angeles, that there's one group of folks who are perfectly suited to entrepreneurship or working at entertainment studios or in tech companies, and another group that are destined for minimum wage jobs for life. So I think, you know, one of the things we should talk about here to help people kind of frame this conversation a little bit is how do we create more surface area of opportunity so that we can connect, you know, young people, that next generation of business leaders and employees and so forth, with opportunities and the skill sets needed to take advantage of those opportunities.
So here's one thing. I think as it relates to diversity, I think that we don't have an issue. There is no issue with diversity here in our city. I think where we do have an issue is making sure that our future workforce is properly trained, or that we are obviously giving access and properly training, you know, specifically, and giving specifically those that are in underrepresented and underserved communities. So let's just take, for example, Hollywood CPR. So Hollywood CPR, for those that don't know, it actually is a program that is housed in West LA. It's a vocational training program that targets underserved and underrepresented populations. It offers training in trades and skills for careers in entertainment specific to labor union jobs. And it provides hands-on experience with professionals in the union and really helps them work towards getting a union card. And as we very well know, a lot of union jobs pay extremely well. And I don't think people are aware that these programs do exist. And then in addition to that, we also have career pathways, which is actually through the California Film Commission. And career pathways is really the vehicle through which IATSE, which is a union, will be working to expand accessibility to the entertainment industry with actual jobs as the end result. So there are definitely programs out there that exist that create the career pathways. And we want to make sure that we are working in collaboration and promoting these pathways into these organizations.
That's where we got to give a shout out to Santa Monica College, West LA College, USC, UCLA, Loyola, Pepperdine. There are a bunch of places that have developed programs really at kind of at every stage and almost for every story, to try to find ways to bring people into either the creative side or the business side of entertainment, which obviously is one of the biggest industries here in Southern California. This idea of career pathways and helping put people on those pathways and helping accelerate their progress along those pathways, I think it's one of the biggest things that we can do to address the diversity and inclusion problem.
Yeah, Jay, you stole my thunder. That to stay on that topic, your friends at Santa Monica College, that Promo Pathways program is a great example of that. You asked for a model, a best practice, and I think from a career pathway standpoint, that Promo Pathways, that shout out to Trish Ramos there, is a real model in terms of adding robustness to that talent pipeline in terms of access to jobs in entertainment, journalism, media, content creation. These are the types of programs we need to be able to scale across industry sectors, up and down the state and in the country, if we're talking about expanding that talent pipeline.
Can you just talk a little bit more about what that program does that you find really helpful?
Well, I mean, I'll point everybody to the website. It's right on SMC Promo Pathways, but it's an employer engagement model that seeks and cultivates skills in specific segments of the entertainment industry and journalism and media, with real practitioners as instructors. I think the state, I think it might be tied to the state's pilot project to create advanced degrees in select community colleges around the state. So I'm not sure if this program is tied to that, but that's another best practice that I think the state should expand as well in terms of access to skills aligned to different industry sectors. It's all a really great model that I think just needs more attention and investment curriculum-wise and across industry sectors.
And so to me, thank you for that. And what makes those kinds of things go to me is when we get corporations in particular to engage and then to provide experiential learning opportunities and jobs to those students in those programs so that there's a destination, right? That may mean in some cases that those institutions, organizations need to be involved in helping to shape those programs. And there are many examples of where companies have come in and helped with that. We have a partnership with Howard University. We've had support from Lionsgate and Disney. Angie just talked about her program and some of the sponsors involved there. But I would love it, and starting with you this time, Angie, if you could talk a little bit about, one, how people can find out about programs like this, and two, from the other perspective, our perspective as the ones who are here in Switzerland trying to kind of help everybody come together, how do we convince organizations to partner with us and create those opportunities, especially when we see the success, right? We see these people at the end of the line, doing exactly what we expected would happen. So how do we get folks engaged and excited to partner with us?
Well, Joe, I think there's a much larger commitment now than there's ever been, right? And I think organizations are having to take a really hard look at their approach, not just with diversity and inclusion, but how they just generally operate business. And we talk about social impact, how committed and how dedicated is your organization to really driving that social impact. And, we have conversations all the time with the D&I folks in a number of organizations. And it's unfortunate because if you look at the diversity reports from UCLA and USC, you absolutely see upticks in D&I, whether it's on screen or off screen, but you're not seeing major increases. And they're really the gatekeepers and the folks in the boardroom and these executives that are ultimately making the decision that have to really want to commit to driving a much more diverse workforce. So again, going back to, how did these folks find out? These organizations are out there. They've been out there. They've been doing this work for so long. It's really the commitment of each organization to want to go out there and connect, genuinely connect and authentically connect with these organizations. I mean, we've been doing it. When you talk about capacity, it's really a team of one, right? That's trying to place these students, trying to do mentorships, trying to do programming. And through the collaboration, it's definitely advantageous and beneficial for both the private sector and the public sector, to want to collaborate on programs such as this. And it's essential. It's an essential work and something that, we all need to commit to. So.
Now, Matt, you have the ear of a lot of business leaders. I mean, for you, when you talk about programs like this or, broader initiatives where we're trying to make a positive social impact, we're trying to drive change in the community and improve the situation around us, how do you get those folks' attention? How do you get them engaged and excited?
Well, that's such a good question. And I don't know if I have the ear of a lot of business folks, but from a public-private partnership standpoint, I think there's more to be done in terms of mapping out how those interactions can produce benefits on the private side, because these are mostly money-making endeavors, but also public benefit, and we need to lead that conversation with what's the public benefit to be had here, the community benefit, the equity, the equity as an output. I think there's a lot of folks that are figuring out some of those elements that go into really well-functioning public-private partnerships. The economic development team down in Long Beach City. Shout out to John Keisler and his team there. But especially on an infrastructure and a business and emerging workforce type of role, they're really, rolling up their sleeves and doing that. But like, again, to Angeline's point, that those capacity issues vary across city, across jurisdictions. So I always talk about P4 now, the public, private, and philanthropic partnerships, and leveraging some of those foundations and or other donors that are interested in doing some of this work. You saw that McKinsey's investment into the CDFIs to promote business formation, entrepreneurs, and efforts like that. I think that's really a vital and crucial narrative that we need to highlight, because there's a huge potential scale there that can increase the prospects for economic mobility in underrepresented communities everywhere. So those are models that we should find and harness as a function of public policy and in terms of replicating and scaling.
So I know we're running short on time, but I did want to make sure, we've talked a little bit about some of the things that organizations can do, how they can get connected, the value of partnerships, the opportunities to kind of help with the talent pipeline and so on. I strongly encourage you to start to spend more time exploring how different educational organizations, nonprofit organizations, how big brands and big companies are trying to help on these issues and figure out ways to support them. But I would ask directly to both of you, looking at the programs that you guys have run yourselves, or programs that you've witnessed that you see other people, really driving, are there places where you feel like there would be resources that would be helpful to you or to people that you know? What do you need? How can the people who are currently watching us, listening to us, all those people, how can they help?
So So as it relates to the Evolve Entertainment Fund, and again, it was launched back in 2018, there are 3 components to the program. 1 is paid internships, 2 is mentorships, and 3 is educational programming. And what we've been really successful at, but definitely from a capacity issue still continue to have challenges, is really looking at organizations, not one to just provide internships, but to provide paid internships, right? So these students that are coming from marginalized communities, underrepresented communities, need jobs, but having the paid internships would absolutely be helpful, and mentorships, and working closely with the private sector and and their executive C-suites and their the executives to really provide mentorships to these students. That really is what's needed. And again, just reiterating, it really all comes down to access and resources, and giving these kids access and resources. And that makes a huge difference. We've definitely seen success, but I also do know the other key focus is obviously life skills. So one, yes, we're giving kids access, but we also want to ensure that when they're in the workplace that they're successful, that they know how to navigate around, these corporate environments. And oftentimes they end up, they're in the workplace, but yet they have challenges. They don't know how to manage up. They don't know how to communicate up. So, Brotherhood Crusade, which is obviously working with Career Pathways and IATSE, is focused on developing life skills. That's another critical component to ensuring the success of these students, not just ensuring that they get through these paid internships, but they also, land full-time jobs once they've completed school. So again, it's a component of access, but yet also teaching them the life skills to help them really build success once they're in.
Love it. Matt?
Yeah, I know you're short on time. I think what we really need, and I guess not as specific as Angeline there, is really dedicated and patient capital, and that's willing to invest in communities and invest in systems. There's a comment in the chat about this, how do we form multiracial collaborations, and I think it's really about engagement there, coupled with investment that's dedicated and then accountable, so that we have the systems in place that are delivering the results that we all think they should be. And that's the kind of, whether it be at your school board or city council or other types of civic engagements, we need those systems to be thinking about the long-term potential of people and what our communities need to look like and what we need to be injecting into those communities in order to get them there.
And I want to just emphasize as we close that when you listen to Matt and Angeline talk about some of these opportunities, really, that there's a lot of potential, both with respect to coalition building and with respect to a sustained social impact where we have a more equitable LA. The mentorship piece, for example. One of the things about one of the consequences of some of the housing discrimination and other types of discrimination that we've seen over the decades is that we have communities that are impoverished economically, but also from the perspective of imagination and a sense of possibility. Young people don't necessarily have an orientation that helps them understand what's out there for them and how they can prepare for those opportunities. Yes, we can provide education, but one of the things that's going to give those young people the motivation to take advantage of that education are going to be relationships where people make those opportunities that are out there for them real to them. Yeah. And to the degree that we can have cross-cultural, multicultural collaborations where people can really invest some time and attention and resources in our young people, and hopefully partner with programs that already exist to provide incentives and rewards at the end of the journey, internships, full-time positions, resources, et cetera. Like, those are things that I think we can do that will be sustainable and that will have a much longer term impact, right? We will be able to see how these young people benefit, and hopefully it will create a more cohesive LA as a result as well. So I know that that's our time. I'm going to kick it back to Charlie, but Angeline, Matt, thank you so much for joining us. I hope we gave you some ideas and some perspective.
Thank you to Jay, Matt, and Angeline for an amazing and insightful panel on how we can all get involved in a very practical way in racial and social justice issues. I'd also like to thank the other moderators and panelists this evening for an amazing program that has shown us the power of allyship and education and the benefit of working together to overcome racial and social justice issues. In addition, I'd like to thank our wonderful partner on this program this evening, the Los Angeles Urban League, and its president, Michael Lawson. In addition, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Storyfile and the Long Family Foundation, for their generous support. And finally, I'd like to thank our promotional partners, Asia Society, the Asian Business League of Southern California, the East Coast Coalition for Tolerance and Non-Discrimination, the Japan America Society, Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, the Milken Institute, the UCLA Center for Management of Enterprises in Media, Entertainment, and Sports at the Anderson School, the USC Marshall School of Business IBEAR MBA program, and the USC US-China Institute. And finally, I'd like to ask everyone here to kindly support us if you'd like to see more program like we've put on this evening. We make all of our programs available for free to the public as a service. And if you would like to see more programming like this, we would very much appreciate it if you could kindly consider joining as a member or to donate. The slides are on the screen now, which will give you the information for which on how you can make a donation or to become a member. Thank you so much and good night.